Picture this. You're 16 years old, minding your own business, probably worried about normal teenage things like whether your crush likes you back, or if you'll pass your Latin exam. Then suddenly, boom, someone slaps a crown on your head and tells you you're the Queen of England. Sounds like a dream, right? Well, not if you're Lady Jane Grey in 1553, because in 9 days you'll be signing your own death warrant. Literally. This is the story of England's most reluctant ruler, and trust me, it makes your Monday morning look like a vacation. If you're ready to dive into a tale that makes Game of Thrones look like a children's bedtime story, hit that subscribe button. We're about to unpack history's most tragic promotion. Let's start with what everyone thinks they know about Lady Jane Grey. She was smart, she was Protestant, she was conveniently related to royalty, and she got caught up in a political mess that wasn't her fault. Sweet, innocent victim of circumstance, right? Well, not exactly. Jane Grey wasn't just smart, she was terrifyingly intelligent. We're talking about a girl who could debate theology and Latin with the most learned scholars of her time, while simultaneously translating Greek philosophy and probably doing her embroidery. In an age when most women were considered educated if they could sign their own name, Jane was writing letters to European reformers about complex Protestant doctrine. She was like if Wikipedia had a human form, but with better posture and a really unfortunate family tree. Born around 1537, Jane was the great-granddaughter of Henry VII, which put her firmly in the Tudor family orbit, close enough to smell the power, far enough away to avoid most of the immediate backstabbing. Her parents, Henry Grey, Duke of Suffolk, and Frances Brandon, were ambitious in that particularly ruthless Tudor way. Think helicopter parents, but with actual helicopters that could drop you into the Tower of London. Frances Brandon, Jane's mother, was Henry VIII's niece, which meant she carried royal blood and royal expectations. She looked at her brilliant daughter and saw opportunity written in golden letters. Jane wasn't just going to be educated, she was going to be weaponized with knowledge. While other noble girls learned to curtsy and look pretty, Jane was being groomed to outthink, outdebate, and outmaneuver anyone who dared question her intellectual authority. But here's where it gets interesting. Jane wasn't some meek bookworm being pushed around by ambitious parents. She had opinions, strong ones. She was a passionate Protestant in an England that had flip-flopped between Catholic and Protestant more times than a politician changes positions during election season. When Henry VIII broke with Rome, England went Protestant. When his daughter Mary eventually took the throne, it would swing back to Catholic. But Jane was ride-or-die Protestant, and she wasn't quiet about it. Imagine being so convinced of your religious beliefs that you'd rather die than compromise them. Now imagine being 16 and feeling that way. Most teenagers can't even decide what to have for breakfast, but Jane Grey was prepared to martyr herself for her faith. It's either incredibly admirable or incredibly terrifying, depending on how you look at it. Her education was overseen by some of the finest Protestant scholars in England. She corresponded with continental reformers and could discuss predestination theory. Like other girls discussed fashion, she read Plato in the original Greek for fun. This wasn't just showing off. Jane genuinely believed that learning was the highest form of worship, that understanding God's creation through scholarship was her divine calling. But let's pause for a moment and consider what this really meant. While other noble children were learning court dances and political small talk, Jane was being prepared for something much more dangerous: independent thought. In Tudor England, having strong opinions was risky enough for a man. For a woman, it was practically suicidal. Yet, there was Jane, forming theological arguments that could challenge bishops and political theories that could topple governments. Her parents watched this intellectual development with the kind of satisfaction that should have been a warning sign. They weren't just proud of their clever daughter, they were calculating. Every book Jane read, every language she mastered, every theological debate she won, was another asset in their political portfolio. They were building the perfect Protestant princess, complete with impeccable bloodlines and unshakable convictions. What makes this even more fascinating is that Jane seemed to understand, at least partially, what was happening to her. She wasn't naive about her family's ambitions or her own value in the marriage market. In letters to friends, she wrote about feeling like a chess piece being moved around a board she couldn't fully see. But here's the thing, she kept playing anyway. Maybe it was because she genuinely believed in her Protestant faith, and wanted to see it triumph in England. Maybe it was because she'd been raised to believe that her intelligence came with responsibility. Or maybe, just maybe, part of her enjoyed being the smartest person in most rooms, and wanted to see how far that could take her. The truth is, probably all of the above, which makes Jane Grey far more complex than the simple innocent victim narrative suggests. She was brilliant, she was devout, she was ambitious in her own way, and she was walking straight into a trap that would make her one of history's most tragic figures. But before we get to the crown and the axe, we need to understand the world that was shaping around her, because while Jane was busy becoming the perfect Protestant intellectual, England was about to experience one of its messiest succession crises, and her education was about to become her death sentence. Let that sink in for a moment. While Jane Grey was busy becoming a theological powerhouse, England had a bigger problem brewing. King Edward VI was dying, and he was only 15 years old. Now, dying teenage kings create the kind of political chaos that makes modern election cycles look like peaceful garden parties. Edward, Henry VIII's long-awaited son, was supposed to secure Protestant England's future for decades. Instead, he was coughing up blood and making everyone around him very, very nervous. Edward VI wasn't just any sick teenager, he was a Protestant sick teenager, with two very Catholic half-sisters in line for the throne. Mary Tudor, Henry's daughter with Catherine of Aragon, had never forgiven England for her mother's humiliation, and was absolutely chomping at the bit to drag the country back to Rome. Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's daughter, was Protestant but also illegitimate in the eyes of many, and nobody was quite sure what she'd do with power anyway. It was like having to choose between a religious extremist and a wild card, with the fate of English Christianity hanging in the balance. John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, was Edward's chief advisor, and the kind of political operator who could smell opportunity in a plague pit. He looked at the succession situation and saw disaster approaching, like a slow-motion avalanche. If Mary became queen, not only would England revert to Catholicism, but everyone who had gotten rich off Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries, including Dudley, would probably find themselves considerably poorer, if not considerably deader. So Dudley did what any ambitious politician would do. He started looking for alternatives. And wouldn't you know it, there was Jane Grey, brilliant and Protestant, and conveniently related to the royal family. She was like a custom-made solution to England's Protestant succession problem, assuming you could overlook the tiny detail that she had no legitimate claim to the throne whatsoever. But here's where Dudley's plan gets deliciously twisted. He couldn't just point at Jane and declare her the next queen. He needed legal cover. So he convinced the dying Edward VII to write what became known as his devise for the succession. This document essentially crossed out Mary and Elizabeth's names from the succession and substituted Jane's instead. It was revolutionary, illegal, and desperate, which in Tudor politics was basically Tuesday. Edward VI, bless his fever-addled teenage heart, actually went along with this plan, whether it was because he genuinely feared Mary's Catholic restoration, because Dudley was incredibly persuasive, or because dying teenagers aren't always the best political strategists is up for debate. But the result was the same. With a few strokes of a royal pen, Lady Jane Grey went from minor noble to heir apparent. Now, you might be wondering how exactly this was supposed to work legally. After all, Henry VIII had already established the succession through Parliamentary Act. Edward, then Mary, then Elizabeth. Edward couldn't just ignore that with a personal document, could he? Well, technically no, but Edward was convinced, or convinced himself, that as king he had the divine right to determine his own succession. Parliamentary Acts be damned. The whole thing was built on the flimsiest legal foundation imaginable. It was like constructing a skyscraper on quicksand, and hoping nobody would notice the building code's violations. But desperate times call for desperate measures, and England's Protestant establishment was nothing if not desperate. Meanwhile, Jane herself seems to have been kept largely in the dark about these machinations. She knew she was being positioned for something important. Her marriage to Dudley's son Guildford was arranged around this time, which should have been a massive red flag. In Tudor England, when powerful dukes start arranging marriages for brilliant young women with royal blood, it's rarely because they think the couple would make cute babies. The marriage itself was another piece of Dudley's elaborate chess game. By marrying Jane to his son, he was ensuring that when she became queen, the Dudley family would be the power behind the throne. It was nepotism on a scale that would make modern political dynasties blush with envy. Guildford Dudley would become king consort, John Dudley would become the real ruler, and England's Protestant Reformation would be safe for another generation. But there was one tiny problem with this brilliant plan. It required Edward VI to actually die before anyone could challenge the device for the succession. Edward was sick, but royal deathbed scenes in the Tudor era were notoriously unpredictable. Sometimes kings lingered for months, giving their enemies time to organize opposition. Sometimes they recovered just enough to change their minds about major political decisions, and sometimes they died so suddenly that nobody had time to implement their final wishes. Edward, considerate teenager that he was, managed to die at just the right pace for Dudley's conspiracy. He lingered long enough for the plans to be finalized, but not so long that word leaked out and Mary could organize a counter-coup. When he finally succumbed to what was probably tuberculosis in July 1553, Dudley was ready to spring his trap. The stage was set for one of English history's most audacious political gambles. A dying boy king had rewritten the succession. A powerful duke had maneuvered his family into position, and somewhere in all this scheming was Jane Grey, brilliant and Protestant and probably having no idea that in a few days she'd be wearing a crown she never wanted and signing documents that would seal her fate. What could possibly go wrong? Well, as it turns out, almost everything. But that's a story for our next chapter, where we'll discover just how spectacularly a plan this ambitious could collapse in the face of one very determined Catholic princess, who refused to accept that her throne had been given away. The crown was waiting. The trap was set. All that remained was to spring it. July 6, 1553. Jane Grey was enjoying what she probably thought was a normal summer day at her family's estate when her world exploded into 1,000 pieces. A delegation arrived from London with news that would change everything. Edward VI was dead, and according to his final wishes, Jane was now Queen of England. Her reaction? She fainted, which, honestly, was probably the most reasonable response anyone had to Tudor politics in years. When Jane came to, she did something that would define her entire 9-day reign. She argued, not about whether she wanted to be queen, she definitely didn't, but about whether she even could be queen legally. This brilliant 16-year-old girl, faced with the crown of England, immediately started pointing out all the legal problems with her own succession. It's like being offered a winning lottery ticket, and spending your time explaining why the numbers might be wrong. "I am not worthy," Jane reportedly said, which sounds humble but was actually her polite, Tudor way of saying, "This is completely insane, and probably illegal." She knew perfectly well that Mary Tudor was the rightful heir under both Henry VIII's will and parliamentary law. She also knew that accepting the crown meant going to war against Henry VIII's daughter, which was roughly equivalent to declaring war against England's entire political establishment. But here's where the story gets really interesting. Despite her protests, despite her fainting, despite her very reasonable objections, Jane ultimately said yes. Why? Was it family pressure, religious conviction, teenage confusion? The answer is probably all three, wrapped up in the kind of impossible situation that makes or breaks historical figures. The coronation ceremony at the Tower of London was surreal in the way that only Tudor political theatre could be. Jane wore crown jewels that probably weighed more than she did, surrounded by nobles who were either terrified of being associated with treason or calculating how to switch sides if things went badly. The Archbishop of Canterbury refused to perform the ceremony. Even religious officials knew a legal disaster when they saw one, so they had to find a more compliant bishop to do the honours. Jane's new husband, Guildford Dudley, immediately started making noises about being crowned king, not just prince consort. This caused Jane to do something remarkable. She told him no. Flat out refused. Here was a 16-year-old girl who had just been handed the most powerful position in England, and her first act of royal authority was to put her own husband in his place. She declared that she might make him a duke, but king? Not happening. Parliament would have to agree to that, and she wasn't about to start handing out crowns willy-nilly. This was either incredibly naive or incredibly shrewd, depending on how you look at it. On one hand, Jane was demonstrating that she understood the limits of royal power and respected constitutional process. On the other hand, she was picking a fight with her most important political ally's family before she'd even been queen for 24 hours. It's the kind of principled stand that historians love and political survivors avoid, like the plague. Meanwhile, the Dudley family was discovering that their brilliant conspiracy had one fatal flaw. They'd forgotten to actually secure popular support. John Dudley had been so focused on legal documents and court intrigue that he'd overlook the minor detail of making sure the English people would accept their new queen. It's like planning the perfect bank heist but forgetting to check if the bank has any money in it. News of Jane's proclamation spread through London like wildfire, and the reaction was mixed. Some people were genuinely excited about having a Protestant queen who could prevent Mary's Catholic restoration. Others were confused about why they'd never heard of this Jane Grey person before, and a significant number were quietly loyal to Mary Tudor, Henry VIII's daughter, regardless of her religion. Jane, meanwhile, was trying to figure out how to actually be queen. She moved into royal apartments at the Tower of London, started receiving briefings from councillors, and attempted to project the kind of authority that usually takes decades to develop. Imagine being thrown into the CEO position at a Fortune 500 company, when you've never even had a summer job. That's roughly what Jane was dealing with, except the company was a kingdom and failure meant execution. Her first royal proclamations were surprisingly competent. She declared her intention to maintain England's Protestant settlement while respecting the rights of her subjects. She promised to rule with wisdom and justice. She even managed to sound like she knew what she was talking about, which was impressive considering she'd learnt about being queen from books rather than experience. But competence wasn't going to be enough. While Jane was settling into her new role and trying to convince herself that maybe this could actually work, Mary Tudor was doing something that would prove far more effective than legal documents or royal proclamations. She was raising an army. The letters started arriving within days of Jane's coronation. Mary had proclaimed herself the rightful queen and was gathering supporters in East Anglia. What started as a trickle of defections from Jane's cause quickly became a flood. Noble families who had initially supported the Protestant succession began hedging their bets. Local officials started quietly ignoring orders from London. The Royal Navy, which should have been Jane's ace in the hole, declared for Mary instead. Jane watched her kingdom melting away like snow in summer, and there wasn't much she could do about it. She was trapped in the Tower of London, theoretically for her own protection, but increasingly it felt more like imprisonment. Her father-in-law John Dudley had taken the army to try to capture Mary, leaving Jane surrounded by increasingly nervous councillors and decreasingly loyal guards. 9 days? That's all it took for Jane Grey's reign to collapse completely. But those 9 days revealed something remarkable about England's most reluctant queen. Faced with an impossible situation, she had tried to do the right thing. She had respected legal limits, stood up to her own family, and attempted to rule justly. It just wasn't enough to save her. The crown was slipping. The kingdom was crumbling. And Jane Grey was about to learn the hardest lesson in Tudor politics. You know that feeling when you're in a group project and you suddenly realize everyone else has abandoned ship, leaving you holding the bag? That was Jane Grey on July 15, 1553. Except instead of a failed presentation, she was facing the collapse of an entire kingdom, and the very real possibility of losing her head. Literally, the signs had been building for days, but Jane seemed determined to maintain royal dignity even as her reign crumbled around her. While her father-in-law John Dudley marched off with an army to capture Mary Tudor, Jane remained in the Tower of London, holding court like everything was perfectly normal. It was either admirable composure or spectacular denial, possibly both. The daily routine of being queen became increasingly surreal. Jane would wake up in royal apartments, attend council meetings where fewer councillors showed up each day, and issue proclamations that fewer people bothered to follow. It was like being the captain of a sinking ship where the crew keeps jumping overboard, but you're still expected to maintain course and speed because technically you're still the captain. Her councillors started developing that particular brand of nervous energy that comes from being associated with what's looking more and more like high treason. They'd arrive late, leave early, and spend most of their time explaining why various policies might need to be reconsidered or postponed pending further consultation. It's the political equivalent of slowly backing away from a conversation while making non-committal noises. Meanwhile, reports kept arriving about Mary's growing support. What had started as a small gathering in East Anglia was becoming a proper army, complete with noble supporters who were bringing their own troops. Even worse, these weren't just random malcontents. They were legitimate members of England's political establishment who genuinely believed Mary was the rightful queen. Jane's response to this crisis reveals something fascinating about her character. Instead of panicking or trying to flee, she doubled down on being queen. She continued signing documents, making appointments, and conducting royal business as if determination alone could make her reign legitimate. It's the kind of stubborn integrity that's either inspiring or heartbreaking, depending on your perspective. But the really crushing blow came from an unexpected source: her own family. Jane's father, Henry Grey, Duke of Suffolk, had initially supported her claim enthusiastically. After all, having a daughter on the throne was the ultimate political achievement for an ambitious Tudor noble. But as Mary's support grew and Jane's prospects dimmed, dear old Dad started having second thoughts about the whole enterprise. The conversation between Jane and her father, when he finally admitted he was switching sides, must have been one of the most brutal in royal history. Imagine being 16 years old, trapped in the Tower of London, watching your kingdom dissolve, and then having your own father basically say, "Well, this was fun, but I'm meant to back the winner now." Henry Grey didn't just abandon Jane politically, he abandoned her personally, leaving his teenage daughter to face the consequences of a conspiracy she'd never really wanted to be part of. The final nail in the coffin came when John Dudley's army simply evaporated. Instead of fighting for Jane's cause, most of his soldiers decided they'd rather be on Mary's side. Thank you very much. Dudley himself was captured without much of a fight, probably because he'd realized that military genius runs in families, and his family had apparently skipped that particular gene. On July 19, 1553, just 9 days after her coronation, Jane's remaining councillors informed her that they were proclaiming Mary Tudor as the rightful queen. The meeting must have been awkward in the way that only Tudor political betrayals could be. These were men who had sworn loyalty to Jane just over a week earlier, and now they were essentially firing her from being Queen of England. Jane's reaction was characteristically dignified and heartbreaking. She reportedly said that if the crown was rightfully Mary's, then she was glad to give it up, because she had never wanted it anyway. She removed the crown jewels, handed over the royal seal, and returned to being Lady Jane Grey, as if the whole thing had been a strange dream. But here's the thing about Tudor politics. Once you've worn the crown, even briefly, you can't just go back to being a regular person. Jane had been queen, which meant she was now a potential threat to whoever actually held the throne. In a more civilized age, she might have been exiled or forced into a convent. In Tudor England, threats to the throne had a tendency to lose their heads. The Tower of London, which had been Jane's royal residence, now became her prison. The same apartments where she'd held court and signed documents became her cell. The same guards who had protected Queen Jane now watched prisoner Jane. It's the kind of ironic reversal that would be funny if it weren't so tragic. As news of Mary's victory spread through London, the city erupted in celebration. People who had been nervously accepting Jane's reign suddenly remembered their loyalty to Henry VIII's daughter. Bonfires were lit, bells were rung, and everyone acted like they'd been supporting Mary all along. It's remarkable how quickly political memory can be revised when the alternative is being charged with treason. Jane, watching from her tower window as London celebrated her downfall, must have felt like the whole world had gone mad. 9 days earlier, she'd been proclaimed queen to general acceptance. Now she was a prisoner, while the same people cheered for her replacement. It was a masterclass in the fickleness of political fortune and the brutal mathematics of Tudor succession. The girl who had fainted when offered a crown was now facing the very real possibility that accepting it might cost her everything. But that's a story for our next chapter, where we'll meet Mary Tudor and discover why being right about royal succession doesn't necessarily make you merciful about royal punishment. The crown was gone. The kingdom had crumbled. All that remained was to see if Jane Grey would survive her brief encounter with royal power. If Jane Grey was England's most reluctant queen, then Mary Tudor was certainly its most determined. When news reached her that her teenage cousin had been proclaimed queen in her place, Mary's reaction wasn't shock, confusion, or political calculation. It was pure, righteous fury. After decades of being declared illegitimate, sidelined, and politically marginalized, someone had finally pushed Mary Tudor too far. And when a Tudor gets pushed too far, things tend to get medieval very quickly. Mary had been waiting for this moment her entire life, though probably not under these exact circumstances. Born in 1516, she'd spent 37 years watching her father tear apart her mother's marriage, declare her illegitimate, and remake English Christianity to suit his romantic whims. She'd survived Henry VIII's reign by keeping her head down and her mouth shut, endured Edward VI's Protestant reforms by attending Protestant services while privately maintaining her Catholic faith, and patiently waited for her turn on the throne that she absolutely knew was rightfully hers. When Edward II died and Jane Grey was proclaimed queen instead, Mary didn't waste time with legal arguments or court intrigue. She did something that shocked everyone, including herself. She raised the standard of rebellion and declared herself the true Queen of England. For a woman who had spent decades being politically cautious to the point of invisibility, it was a remarkably bold move. It was like watching a librarian suddenly decide to become a professional wrestler. Mary's base of operations was East Anglia, a region that was both strategically important and personally loyal to her. These were people who remembered her mother, Catherine of Aragon, with genuine affection and who had never accepted the legitimacy of Henry VIII's divorce. They looked at Mary Tudor and saw not just the rightful heir, but vindication for decades of political and religious upheaval. The speed with which Mary's support grew was breathtaking. What started as a handful of loyal retainers quickly became a proper court, complete with noble supporters, military commanders, and all the apparatus of royal government. It was like watching a government in exile suddenly become an actual government, except the exile had lasted most of Mary's adult life. But Mary's success wasn't just about legitimacy or popular support. It was about her personality. After years of being underestimated as a spinster princess with outdated religious views, Mary revealed herself to be a formidable political operator. She understood timing, she knew how to inspire loyalty, and she had the kind of steely determination that comes from decades of surviving Tudor family dynamics. Her proclamations as the rightful queen were masterpieces of political messaging. She didn't just assert her legal claim, she positioned herself as the defender of English tradition against foreign Protestant innovations. She promised to restore the old religion while respecting the rights of her subjects. She managed to sound both revolutionary and conservative at the same time, which is a neat trick in any political era. The contrast with Jane Grey couldn't have been more stark. While Jane was trapped in the Tower of London, issuing increasingly desperate proclamations to a kingdom that was abandoning her daily, Mary was actively building a coalition and projecting the kind of confidence that makes people want to follow you into battle. Jane had legitimacy on paper. Mary had legitimacy in practice. What's particularly fascinating is how Mary handled the defections from Jane's cause. As noble families and military commanders switched sides, Mary didn't just accept their support, she made them feel like they were making the morally correct choice. She portrayed joining her cause not as opportunistic betrayal, but as returning to righteousness after a period of confusion. It was brilliant political psychology. The Royal Navy's decision to support Mary instead of Jane was particularly crushing for the Protestant cause. Naval commanders declared that they served Henry VIII's daughter, not some upstart teenager with questionable legal claims. When your own military starts picking sides against you, it's usually time to update your resume, assuming you'll live long enough to need one. Mary's march toward London became a triumphal procession rather than a military campaign. Towns opened their gates, local officials switched sides, and what should have been a dangerous rebellion started looking more like a royal progress. People lined the roads to cheer for Henry VIII's daughter, and Mary played the part perfectly. Gracious, regal, and absolutely certain of her divine right to rule. The psychological impact on Jane's supporters was devastating. It's one thing to back a losing cause when you think you might still win. It's quite another to watch your opposition gain strength daily while your own position crumbles. John Dudley's attempted march to capture Mary became increasingly half-hearted as his own soldiers started questioning whether they were on the right side. By the time Mary reached the outskirts of London, Jane's government had essentially ceased to function. Councillors were abandoning their posts, the treasury was running low, and even Jane's own family was looking for ways to distance themselves from the whole enterprise. Mary hadn't just won the succession crisis, she'd won it so decisively that her opponents barely put up a fight. The final surrender was almost anticlimactic. Jane's remaining councillors didn't even wait for Mary to enter London before proclaiming her the rightful queen. They probably figured that getting ahead of the inevitable might earn them some mercy points when the new regime started settling accounts. It was the kind of political calculation that Tudor nobles had perfected over decades of surviving dynastic changes. Mary's entry into London was everything Jane's proclamation had tried to be, but couldn't achieve. A genuine expression of popular will. The crowds weren't just celebrating because they were supposed to, they were genuinely excited to see Henry VIII's daughter finally claim her inheritance. Bells rang, bonfires were lit, and the city erupted in the kind of spontaneous celebration that money can't buy and force can't fake. But victory, even total victory, comes with its own problems. Mary Tudor was now Queen of England, which meant she had to decide what to do with the people who had tried to steal her throne. And unfortunately for Jane Grey, mercy wasn't exactly a Tudor family trait. The rightful queen had returned. The usurpers had been defeated. Now came the reckoning. Here's the thing about Mary Tudor that makes her story so tragically complex. She genuinely wanted to be merciful. When she entered London in triumph, she wasn't thinking about executions and blood. She was thinking about healing, forgiveness, and bringing England back together under the true faith. Mary had spent decades dreaming about this moment, and in her dreams she was a magnanimous queen who would right the wrongs of the past through compassion rather than violence. Reality, unfortunately, had other plans. Mary's initial handling of the Jane Grey situation was actually remarkably restrained by Tudor standards. She could have ordered immediate executions for everyone involved in the conspiracy. Treason was treason, after all, and Tudor monarchs weren't known for their lenient treatment of people who tried to steal their crowns. Instead, Mary chose a more nuanced approach that revealed both her political wisdom and her personal complexity. Jane herself was sentenced to death, along with her husband Guildford Dudley, but Mary made it clear that she had no intention of carrying out the sentences immediately. It was like putting someone on death row with no execution date, technically condemned, but practically spared. Jane would remain in comfortable imprisonment in the Tower of London, while Mary figured out what to do with England's most inconvenient teenager. This wasn't just mercy, it was smart politics. Executing Jane immediately would have made Mary look vindictive and cruel, potentially alienating the Protestant nobles whose support she needed to govern effectively. By showing restraint, Mary demonstrated that she could be both strong enough to defend her throne and wise enough to temper justice with mercy. It was exactly the kind of sophisticated political balancing act that successful monarchs master. John Dudley, Jane's father-in-law, and the mastermind behind the whole conspiracy, wasn't so fortunate. His execution was swift and public, which sent exactly the message Mary wanted. The leaders of treasonous plots would pay the ultimate price, but their unwilling accomplices might find forgiveness. Dudley's death also served the practical purpose of removing the most dangerous Protestant plotter from the equation while leaving room for others to seek mercy. Jane's father, Henry Grey, Duke of Suffolk, managed to worm his way back into Mary's good graces through a combination of grovelling, strategic helplessness, and probably some behind-the-scenes deal-making. Mary pardoned him entirely, which must have been galling for Jane to watch from her tower window. Dear old Dad had abandoned his daughter when her cause looked hopeless, then secured his own pardon while she remained under sentence of death. It's the kind of paternal betrayal that makes normal family dysfunction look wholesome by comparison. The conditions of Jane's imprisonment were surprisingly comfortable. All things considered, she had books, she could write letters, she received visitors, and she was treated with the respect due to someone of her noble rank. It wasn't freedom, but it wasn't the kind of harsh captivity that usually preceded Tudor executions. Mary seemed genuinely hopeful that time and gentle persuasion might solve the Jane Grey problem without bloodshed. Mary even attempted something that seems almost touching in its naivety. She tried to convert Jane to Catholicism. If Jane would just renounce her Protestant heresies and embrace the true faith, Mary reasoned, then the whole succession crisis could be resolved without anyone losing their head. Jane could be pardoned, possibly even restored to some position of honor, and England could move forward, united under Catholic rule. The theological debates between Mary's representatives and Jane became legendary among contemporary observers. Here was a 17-year-old girl, imprisoned and under sentence of death, engaging in sophisticated religious arguments with some of the most learned Catholic scholars in England. Jane didn't just refuse to convert, she systematically dismantled Catholic doctrine with the kind of intellectual precision that probably made Mary's advisors question their own career choices. Jane's letters from this period reveal someone who had found a strange kind of peace in her impossible situation. She wrote about accepting God's will, about finding comfort in Scripture, and about preparing herself for whatever fate awaited her. There's none of the self-pity or rage you might expect from someone whose brief reign had ended in imprisonment and condemnation. Instead, there's a kind of serene resignation that makes her story even more heartbreaking. But Mary's patience with Jane's Protestant stubbornness was wearing thin. and events outside the tower were making Jane's continued existence increasingly problematic. Mary's marriage negotiations with Philip II of Spain were generating serious Protestant opposition, and Jane's very presence in the tower was becoming a rallying point for anyone unhappy with Catholic restoration. As long as Jane lived, she remained a potential alternative queen for Protestant conspirators. The breaking point came with Wyatt's rebellion in early 1554. Thomas Wyatt, a Protestant nobleman, raised an army in Kent and marched on London to prevent Mary's Spanish marriage. The rebellion failed, but it terrified Mary's government because it demonstrated that Protestant opposition to her reign was still very much alive. Even worse, the rebels had explicitly mentioned restoring Jane to the throne as one of their objectives. Mary's counsellors pointed out the obvious problem. As long as Jane Grey remained alive, she would be a focus for every future Protestant conspiracy. It didn't matter that Jane herself had nothing to do with Wyatt's rebellion. Her mere existence was enough to inspire others to treason. From a purely practical standpoint, keeping Jane alive was becoming a security risk that Mary's government couldn't afford. The decision to proceed with Jane's execution wasn't made in anger or revenge. It was made with the cold calculation of political necessity. Mary had tried mercy, had attempted conversion, had hoped that time and gentle treatment might resolve the situation peacefully. But the mathematics of Tudor politics were unforgiving. Rival claimants to the throne, however unwilling, eventually had to be eliminated. Mary's famous comment about the decision reveals her genuine anguish. She said that Jane's death was necessary for the security of the realm. It wasn't vengeance or cruelty driving the decision. It was the brutal logic of monarchical survival. Sometimes being a successful queen meant making choices that kept you awake at night. The mercy had run out. The politics had turned deadly. And Jane Grey was about to pay the ultimate price for a crown she had never wanted to wear. Inside the Tower of London, while political machinations swirled around her like storm clouds, Jane Grey was undergoing a transformation that would secure her place in history as something far more powerful than a failed queen. She was becoming a martyr, but this wasn't the passive, victimized kind of martyrdom that historians sometimes portray. Jane was actively, intellectually, and deliberately preparing herself for death in a way that was both heartbreaking and profoundly impressive. The months between Jane's capture and her execution were filled with what can only be described as an intensive course in dying well. In Tudor England, how you faced death was considered a reflection of your character, your faith, and your worthiness for salvation. Jane, with her typical scholarly thoroughness, approached her own mortality like she was studying for the most important exam of her life, which, in a very real sense, she was. Her reading list during imprisonment reads like a graduate course in Protestant theology and classical philosophy. She had Plato, the complete works of Protestant reformers, and extensive biblical commentaries. While most teenagers might have spent their final months raging against injustice or desperately plotting escape, Jane spent hers reading, writing, and engaging in theological debates with anyone brave enough to visit a condemned traitor. The most fascinating aspect of Jane's imprisonment was her correspondence with various religious figures who attempted to convert her to Catholicism. Mary's government wasn't just keeping Jane alive out of mercy. They were genuinely hoping that scholarly debate might succeed where political pressure had failed. If Jane could be convinced to renounce her Protestant beliefs, it would delegitimize the entire Protestant cause and make her execution unnecessary. Dr. John Feckenham, Mary's chaplain, and later Abbot of Westminster, engaged in extensive theological discussions with Jane that were recorded and later published. These weren't casual conversations about faith. They were sophisticated academic debates between two highly educated religious thinkers, one trying to save a soul and the other defending what she considered eternal truth. Reading their exchanges is like watching a chess match played with biblical verses and patristic quotations. Jane's responses to Catholic arguments reveal not just her Protestant convictions, but her remarkable intellectual maturity under impossible circumstances. She didn't simply reject Catholic doctrine. She systematically explained why she found it unconvincing, cited specific scriptural passages to support her positions, and even managed to do it all with a kind of respectful firmness that impressed even her opponents. What makes this even more extraordinary is that Jane was 17 years old and facing execution. Most people under that kind of pressure might be expected to say whatever their captors wanted to hear, especially if it meant saving their lives. Jane's refusal to compromise her religious beliefs, even when conversion offered the possibility of pardon, demonstrated either remarkable courage or remarkable stubbornness. Probably both. Her letters from this period also reveal something unexpected. Jane had found a kind of peace in her imprisonment. She wrote to friends and family members about accepting God's will, about finding comfort in adversity, and about preparing herself spiritually for whatever fate awaited her. There's no self-pity in these letters, no desperate pleading for rescue, no rage against the injustice of her situation. Instead, there's a kind of serene resignation that makes her story even more poignant. Jane's relationship with her husband, Guildford Dudley, during their imprisonment, adds another layer of complexity to this story. They were housed in separate parts of the tower, but they could see each other during their daily exercise periods. Guildford, unlike Jane, seems to have spent his captivity in a state of increasing desperation and self-pity. While Jane was writing theological treatises, Guildford was reportedly begging for mercy and considering conversion to Catholicism if it might save his life. The contrast between their responses to imprisonment reveals something fundamental about their characters. Jane faced death like a scholar facing a difficult problem, with careful study, systematic preparation, and intellectual rigor. Guildford faced death like a frightened teenager who had gotten in over his head, which, to be fair, is exactly what he was. Neither response was wrong, but Jane's calm acceptance of her fate made her a much more compelling figure for Protestant propaganda. As Wyatt's rebellion unfolded in early 1554, Jane must have realized that her situation was becoming increasingly hopeless. The rebellion wasn't her fault. She had no connection to it, and she probably never even knew about it until after it failed. But its mere existence proved Mary's counselor's point. As long as Jane lived, she would be a symbol for Protestant resistance, whether she wanted to be or not. Jane's reaction to learning about her impending execution is one of the most remarkable moments in Tudor history. According to contemporary accounts, she received the news with calm acceptance, saying that she was ready to die because she had lived according to her conscience and her faith. She asked only for a few days to prepare herself spiritually, which was granted. It's the kind of response that either demonstrates incredible courage or incredible resignation to an unjust fate, possibly both. The final weeks before her execution were spent in intense spiritual preparation. Jane wrote letters to her family members, particularly her sister Catherine, offering advice about faith, virtue, and the importance of remaining true to one's beliefs, regardless of worldly consequences. These letters read like a teenage girl trying to compress a lifetime of wisdom into a few pages, knowing she would never have another chance to share what she had learned. She also spent time writing what amounted to her spiritual autobiography, a detailed account of her religious convictions, her reasons for accepting and then giving up the crown, and her preparations for death. This document, which survived and was later published by Protestant propagandists, became one of the most powerful pieces of Protestant martyrology ever written. Jane had managed to transform her political failure into religious triumph. By February 1554, Jane Grey had completed her transformation from reluctant queen to willing martyr. She had spent months preparing herself intellectually, spiritually, and emotionally for death, and she was ready to face her fate with the kind of dignity that would make her story legendary among English Protestants. The education was complete. The transformation was finished. All that remained was the final examination, one that would be graded with an axe. February 12, 1554, dawned grey and cold over London, which seemed appropriate for what was about to become one of the most tragically memorable executions in English history. Jane Grey woke up knowing it would be her last morning, and according to every contemporary account, she faced that knowledge with a composure that was either inspiring or heartbreaking, probably both. The night before, Jane had watched from her tower window as her husband Guildford was led out to his execution on Tower Hill. The public nature of his death, in front of a crowd of curious Londoners, was both a warning to potential traitors and a spectacle for the masses. Guildford, who had spent his imprisonment alternately begging for mercy and raging against his fate, apparently died with more dignity than he had lived, though the bar for that particular achievement wasn't set very high. Jane's execution would be different. Because of her royal blood and gender, she would die privately within the Tower grounds, witnessed only by a small group of officials and selected observers. It was a courtesy extended to her noble status, but it also meant that her final moments would be recorded by people who actually knew her rather than anonymous crowd members looking for entertainment. The morning routine was surreal in its normalcy. Jane dressed carefully, choosing a simple black gown that was both appropriate for the occasion and symbolic of her Protestant faith. She spent time in prayer, read from her Bible one final time, and wrote a few last letters to family members. It's remarkable how mundane the preparations for death can be when you've had months to think about them. Jane's demeanor on the morning of her execution became legendary among those who witnessed it. She was calm, composed, and apparently at peace with her fate in a way that impressed even hardened Tower officials who had seen plenty of executions. This wasn't the hysterical acceptance of someone in shock. It was the deliberate serenity of someone who had made peace with mortality through careful intellectual and spiritual preparation. The scaffold had been erected on Tower Green, a small patch of grass within the Tower walls that had witnessed other notable executions, including Anne Boleyn's 18 years earlier. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present. Another young woman with royal connections was about to lose her head for political reasons, largely beyond her control. Tudor politics had a way of repeating itself with variations. Jane's final speech to the small crowd of witnesses has become one of the most quoted last statements in English history. And for good reason. She didn't waste time proclaiming her innocence or begging for mercy. Instead, she used her final public moment to deliver what amounted to a theological lecture, combined with a political statement that was both defiant and gracious. I pray you all, good Christian people, to bear me witness that I die a true Christian woman, Jane began, and that I look to be saved by none other means, but only by the mercy of God in the merits of the blood of his only Son, Jesus Christ. It was a carefully crafted statement that affirmed her Protestant faith while avoiding direct criticism of Mary's Catholic restoration, defiant enough to make a point, diplomatic enough to avoid giving offense. She went on to acknowledge that her acceptance of the crown had been wrong, but framed it as a mistake rather than a crime. I did unlawfully accept the crown, she said, but only at the urging of others, and against her own better judgment. It was a masterful piece of final rhetoric that took responsibility for her actions while making it clear that the entire conspiracy had been orchestrated by people who were now safely dead or pardoned. The most remarkable part of Jane's final speech was her refusal to use the moment for self-pity or dramatic effect. She could have railed against injustice, pleaded for mercy, or delivered a stirring denunciation of Mary's government. Instead, she used her last public words to demonstrate the intellectual and spiritual qualities that had made her remarkable: reasoned argument, theological precision, and dignified acceptance of consequences. After finishing her speech, Jane approached the block with the kind of composure that witnesses described as almost supernatural. She knelt down, arranged her skirts modestly, and prepared to place her head on the block. Then something happened that nearly broke everyone's composure. Jane couldn't see the block because they had blindfolded her first, and she began groping around frantically, asking, "What shall I do? Where is it?" This moment of very human confusion in the midst of her otherwise perfectly controlled final performance was heartbreaking for witnesses. Here was a 17-year-old girl, faced with death, momentarily reduced to the kind of frightened disorientation that anyone might experience under similar circumstances. Someone guided her hands to the block, and she was able to compose herself for the final moment. Jane's last words were reportedly a variation of Christ's final prayer: "Lord, into thy hands I commend my spirit." It was theologically appropriate, personally meaningful, and historically resonant, exactly the kind of final statement you'd expect from someone who had spent months preparing for this moment with scholarly thoroughness. The executioner's axe fell cleanly, ending Jane Grey's life at age 17. After a reign of 9 days and an imprisonment of 6 months. The crowd of witnesses reportedly stood in stunned silence for several moments after the execution, apparently overwhelmed by what they had just seen. Even people accustomed to Tudor political violence seemed shaken by watching someone so young die with such dignity. The immediate aftermath was handled with the kind of efficiency that comes from institutional experience with high-profile executions. Jane's body was wrapped in cloth and buried immediately in the Tower's chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, alongside other executed nobles including Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard. Her head was reportedly displayed briefly as required by law, then buried with her body. Mary Tudor, when informed that the execution had been carried out, reportedly showed visible distress despite having ordered it. The decision to execute Jane had been political necessity rather than personal revenge, and Mary seemed to genuinely regret that mercy hadn't been possible. It was the kind of choice that successful monarchs have to make and then live with for the rest of their lives. The performance was over, the stage was empty, but the legend was just beginning. Death, as it turns out, was the best career move Jane Grey ever made. Within hours of her execution, Protestant propagandists across Europe were already spinning her story into something that would outlive Mary Tudor's entire reign and help shape English religious identity for centuries. Jane Grey, reluctant queen, had become Jane Grey, Protestant martyr, and martyrs, unlike failed monarchs, have a tendency to become immortal. The transformation began almost immediately. John Foxe, the great Protestant historian and propagandist, was already collecting testimonies from witnesses to Jane's execution, gathering copies of her letters and theological writings, and preparing to include her story in what would become his monumental Acts and Monuments. Better known as Foxe's Book of Martyrs, Jane was about to become the starring character in one of the most influential religious texts in English history. But here's what makes Jane's posthumous reputation so fascinating. It wasn't entirely manufactured propaganda. Her actual behavior during imprisonment and execution had been genuinely impressive by any reasonable standard. She really had faced death with remarkable courage, really had engaged in sophisticated theological debate with her would-be converters, and really had maintained her principles under pressure that would have broken most people. The Protestant propagandists didn't need to invent Jane Grey the martyr. They just needed to publicize Jane Grey the person. Foxe's account of Jane's story, published in successive editions throughout the later 16th century, became the definitive version for English Protestants. He had access to Jane's actual letters, transcripts of her theological debates, and first-hand testimony from people who had known her personally. The result was a narrative that was both politically useful and essentially accurate. The best kind of propaganda, in other words. The letters Jane had written during her imprisonment became particularly powerful pieces of Protestant literature. Her correspondence with her sister Catherine, advising her to remain true to Protestant faith regardless of worldly pressures, read like a teenage girl trying to compress a lifetime of wisdom into her final words. Her theological arguments with Dr. Feckenham demonstrated that Protestant doctrine could hold its own against the most learned Catholic scholars. Her final spiritual reflections showed a level of religious maturity that was remarkable in someone so young. What Protestant readers found most compelling about Jane's story was how perfectly it illustrated their theological principles about salvation, persecution, and faithfulness unto death. Jane had been saved by faith alone, not by good works or Catholic sacraments. She had been persecuted for her religious convictions by a Catholic monarch, and she had chosen death rather than compromise her beliefs. It was like Protestant theology had been illustrated through the life story of an actual person rather than abstract doctrine. The timing of Jane's story couldn't have been better for Protestant propaganda purposes. Mary Tudor's reign was becoming increasingly unpopular due to her marriage to Philip II of Spain, her persecution of Protestant reformers, and her general association with foreign Catholic influence. Jane Grey provided a perfect counter-narrative, a young, English, Protestant alternative who had died for her faith rather than compromise with Rome. She became the symbol of everything Mary's reign was destroying. European Protestant reformers quickly adopted Jane's story for their own purposes. Her letters were translated into Latin, French, and German, spreading her reputation across the continental reform movement. Here was proof that English Protestantism could produce martyrs just as committed as any continental reformer, and that Catholic persecution in England was just as brutal as anywhere else in Europe. Jane Grey became an international symbol of Protestant resistance to Catholic oppression. The contrast between Jane's reputation and Mary Tudor's became increasingly stark as Mary's reign progressed. While Jane was remembered as a learned, pious, and courageous young woman who had died for her faith, Mary was increasingly seen as a foreign-influenced persecutor who burned English Protestants for their religious convictions. The optics couldn't have been worse for Mary or better for Jane's posthumous reputation. Jane's execution also served as a rallying point for English Protestant resistance to Mary's policies. Every time Mary's government burned another Protestant reformer, Jane Grey's name was invoked as an example of Catholic cruelty toward innocent English believers. She became the face of Protestant victimhood in a way that was both historically accurate and politically devastating to Mary's attempts to legitimize her Catholic restoration. The publication of Jane's theological writings had an impact that went far beyond their immediate political usefulness. Her arguments with Catholic scholars demonstrated that Protestant women could be just as intellectually formidable as Protestant men, which was a significant point in 16th century religious debate. Jane became proof that Protestant emphasis on individual Bible reading and personal faith could produce remarkable religious insights even in young women. By the time Elizabeth I became queen in 1558, Jane Grey's reputation as a Protestant martyr was already well established. Elizabeth, who had her own complicated relationship with the Protestant cause, was smart enough to recognize the political value of Jane's story. She didn't actively promote Jane Grey propaganda, but she didn't discourage it either, and during Elizabeth's reign, Jane's reputation continued to grow. The long-term impact of Jane Grey's martyrdom on English Protestant identity can hardly be overstated. She became the perfect example of how individual conscience should triumph over political pressure, how true faith should be maintained regardless of worldly consequences, and how young English Protestants should face persecution with courage and dignity. Sunday school teachers would be telling children about Jane Grey's courage for centuries to come. What's particularly interesting is how Jane's story evolved over time to meet different political needs. During Elizabeth's reign, she was an example of Protestant courage under Catholic persecution. During the English Civil War, she was cited as an example of righteous resistance to tyrannical monarchy. During later religious controversies, she was invoked as an example of principled nonconformity. Jane Grey became whatever English Protestants needed her to be at any particular historical moment. The irony, of course, is that Jane herself would probably have been horrified by her posthumous reputation. She had never wanted to be queen, had never sought martyrdom, and had certainly never intended to become a symbol of anything beyond her own personal faith. But history, particularly religious history, has a way of transforming reluctant participants into legendary figures, whether they want the honor or not. The person was dead, but the legend was immortal. And sometimes, in history, that's the most important distinction of all. Here's the thing about Jane Grey that most people miss. Her 9-day reign wasn't actually a failure. It was a catastrophic political disaster. Yes, but it accomplished something far more significant than most successful monarchs manage in decades of ruling. Jane Grey's brief time on the throne and dignified death fundamentally changed how the English thought about royal legitimacy, religious conviction, and the relationship between personal conscience and political power. Not bad for a teenager who never wanted to be queen in the first place. Let's start with the most obvious accomplishment. Jane Grey proved that royal blood alone wasn't enough to make someone a legitimate monarch. Her impeccable Tudor lineage, her superior education, and her unquestionable moral character couldn't overcome the simple fact that the English people preferred Mary Tudor's stronger hereditary claim. Jane's failure established a precedent that would shape English constitutional thinking for centuries. Popular acceptance matters more than theoretical legal arguments when it comes to royal succession. This wasn't just an academic point about constitutional law. It was a practical demonstration that had immediate political consequences. When Mary Tudor died, childless 5 years later, there was no question that Elizabeth I would inherit the throne. Despite the fact that many Catholics still considered her illegitimate, Jane Grey's failed coup had effectively settled the succession question by proving that attempting to bypass the established line of inheritance was political suicide. Jane's theological writings during her imprisonment accomplished something equally important for English Protestantism. They provided intellectual respectability for the reform movement at exactly the moment when it needed credible spokespersons. Mary Tudor's Catholic restoration had put English Protestants on the defensive, forcing them to explain why their relatively new religious ideas were worth dying for. Jane Grey's sophisticated theological arguments, written by a 17-year-old girl under sentence of death, provided exactly the kind of compelling apologetic that the Protestant cause desperately needed. Her debates with Dr. Feckenham weren't just personal exchanges. They were published and widely circulated as examples of how educated Protestants should respond to Catholic arguments. Jane's ability to hold her own against learned Catholic scholars, while maintaining both her intellectual integrity and her personal dignity, made her an ideal spokesperson for Protestant principles. She proved that Protestant doctrine wasn't just popular rebellion against traditional authority, but a legitimate theological position that could be defended through careful scholarship. The manner of Jane's death accomplished something even more significant. It demonstrated that Protestant conviction could produce the same kind of heroic martyrdom that Catholics claimed was unique to their faith. Mary Tudor's government was burning Protestant reformers by the hundreds, but most of these victims were common people whose names and stories weren't widely known. Jane Grey was different. She was noble, educated, young, and photogenic by Tudor standards, and her execution was witnessed and recorded by people who could write compelling accounts of her courage. Jane's transformation into a Protestant martyr provided English reformers with exactly the kind of inspiring figure they needed to compete with Catholic saints and martyrs. She wasn't just someone who had died for Protestant principles, she was someone who had died for them with such grace and intelligence that even her Catholic executioners were impressed. It's hard to overstate how valuable this was for Protestant morale during Mary's persecution. From a purely political standpoint, Jane's reign accomplished something that might seem contradictory. It actually strengthened the Tudor dynasty by demonstrating how difficult it was to overthrow. The Jane Grey conspiracy had been organised by some of the most powerful Protestant nobles in England, backed by significant financial resources, and supported by a substantial portion of the political establishment. If such a well-planned coup could collapse in 9 days, it proved that the Tudor hold on power was stronger than anyone had realised. Jane's failure also accomplished something crucial for future English political development. It established that religious conviction, however sincere, couldn't justify overthrowing established government. This principle would become increasingly important as England developed its distinctive approach to religious tolerance and constitutional monarchy. Jane Grey's coup failed not because her Protestant beliefs were wrong, but because she had no legitimate claim to impose those beliefs on England through force. The educational impact of Jane's story was equally significant. Her remarkable learning became part of her legend, inspiring generations of English parents to invest in their daughters' education. If a learned woman could engage in theological debate with the finest Catholic scholars and maintain her intellectual dignity even under threat of death, then clearly female education was worth taking seriously. Jane Grey became an early example of what educated women could accomplish, which was no small thing in 16th century England. Jane's correspondence during her imprisonment also accomplished something important for English literary culture. It provided a model for how educated people should write about serious subjects. Her letters combined personal sincerity with theological sophistication, emotional honesty with intellectual rigor, and spiritual conviction with political awareness. They became widely studied as examples of how to discuss religious and political topics with both passion and precision. Perhaps most importantly, Jane Grey's story accomplished something that no successful monarch could have achieved. It created a permanent reminder that political power comes with moral responsibility. Jane had accepted a crown she didn't want because she believed it was her duty to preserve Protestant England, and she had paid for that decision with her life. Her story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of political ambition, but also an inspiring example of how personal integrity should guide political choices. The long-term constitutional impact of Jane's reign was subtle but significant. Her failure helped establish the principle that English succession should follow established law rather than the religious preferences of powerful nobles. This principle would prove crucial during later succession crises, particularly when Catholic monarchs tried to alter the Protestant settlement, or when Protestant politicians attempted to exclude Catholic heirs. Jane Grey's 9-day reign also accomplished something that successful monarchs often fail to achieve. It created a lasting legacy that transcended immediate political circumstances. Long after Mary Tudor's Catholic restoration had been reversed and forgotten, Jane Grey's story continued to inspire English Protestants, educate English children, and influence English political thinking. Her failure as a queen became her success as a historical figure. She had lost a kingdom, but won immortality. In the mathematics of historical achievement, that's not such a bad trade. Let's take a moment to talk about the real villains in Jane Grey's story, because it's not who you think. Sure, Mary Tudor ordered Jane's execution, but Mary was protecting her legitimate claim to a throne that was rightfully hers. The real villains were the adults who manipulated a brilliant teenager into accepting a crown that would become her death sentence, all while pursuing their own political and financial interests. This is a story about how ambitious men used an idealistic girl as a pawn in their power games, and how those same men abandoned her the moment their schemes started falling apart. John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, is the obvious starting point for any villain's gallery. Dudley was the kind of political operator who could see opportunity in a plague outbreak and profit in a civil war. When Edward VI was dying and the Protestant succession looked threatened, Dudley didn't see a constitutional crisis. He saw a chance to position his family at the centre of English politics for the next generation. Dudley's manipulation of the dying Edward VI was masterful in its cynicism. He convinced a sick teenager that his half-sister Mary would destroy everything Edward had worked for, drag England back to Rome, and persecute all the good Protestants who had supported the reform movement. None of this was technically untrue. But Dudley wasn't motivated by religious conviction or concern for England's spiritual welfare. He was motivated by the fact that a Catholic restoration would cost him his power, his wealth, and quite possibly his head. The marriage he arranged between Jane and his son Guildford was particularly calculating. Dudley knew that Jane's bloodline gave her a theoretical claim to the throne, and by marrying her to Guildford, he was ensuring that any future reign would benefit the Dudley family directly. It wasn't enough for Dudley to be the power behind the throne. He wanted his son to actually be on the throne, with himself as the real ruler pulling the strings from behind the scenes. What makes Dudley's behavior even more reprehensible is how quickly he abandoned Jane when his scheme started collapsing. The moment Mary Tudor began raising an army, Dudley marched off to capture her, leaving Jane isolated in the Tower of London with increasingly nervous councillors and decreasingly loyal guards. When his own army started defecting to Mary, Dudley didn't fight to the death for the cause he had convinced Jane was worth dying for. He tried to negotiate his own survival by switching sides. Jane's parents, Henry Grey and Frances Brandon, were almost worse than Dudley because their betrayal was personal as well as political. They had raised Jane to be the perfect Protestant princess, filled her head with ideas about duty and religious conviction, and then pushed her into accepting a crown that any competent political analysis would have shown was a death trap. They knew the risks, they understood the legal problems, and they did it anyway, because they saw a chance to have their daughter become Queen of England. Henry Grey's behaviour after Jane's capture was particularly despicable. He abandoned his daughter's cause the moment it became clear that Mary was going to win, then negotiated his own pardon, while Jane remained under sentence of death. What kind of father saves his own skin while leaving his teenage daughter to face execution alone? Henry Grey managed to be both politically stupid and personally cowardly, which is an impressive combination even by Tudor standards. Frances Brandon's role in the conspiracy is often overlooked, but she was arguably the most crucial villain in Jane's story. As Henry VIII's niece and Jane's mother, Frances had the royal connections that made the whole scheme possible. She also had significant influence over Jane, and could have prevented the entire disaster by refusing to allow her daughter to accept the crown. Instead, Frances seems to have been one of the most enthusiastic supporters of Jane's elevation, probably because she relished the idea of being the Queen Mother. The Protestant nobles who initially supported Jane's claim, and then abandoned her when Mary's army started growing, deserve special mention in any villain's gallery. These men had encouraged Jane to accept the crown, sworn loyalty to her reign, and promised to defend her against all enemies. When actual conflicts became likely, most of them suddenly discovered reasons why Mary Tudor might be the rightful queen after all. Their behavior reveals something ugly about Tudor political culture. Loyalty was conditional, principles were negotiable, and survival trumped honor every single time. Jane Grey had accepted their advice, trusted their promises, and relied on their support. They repaid that trust by abandoning her the moment it became politically inconvenient to keep their word. Edward VI himself bears some responsibility for Jane's fate, though his youth and illness make him more of a tragic figure than a true villain. Edward genuinely believed that preventing Mary's Catholic restoration was worth overturning parliamentary succession law, and he was probably sincere in his religious convictions. But sincerity doesn't excuse the legal and political recklessness of his device for the succession. Edward was old enough to understand that naming Jane as his heir was essentially signing her death warrant if the plan failed. The councillors who supported Jane's proclamation, and then switched sides when Mary's victory became inevitable, represent everything that was corrupt about Tudor politics. These were experienced political operators who understood exactly what they were doing when they supported Jane's claim. They knew the legal problems, they understood the political risks, and they recognized that failure would mean treason charges for everyone involved. They supported Jane anyway, but only as long as it looked like she might win. When Mary's triumph became obvious, these same councillors didn't just abandon Jane, they actively betrayed her by proclaiming Mary as the rightful queen before Mary had even reached London. It was a desperate attempt to get on the winning side before the new regime started settling accounts, and it left Jane completely isolated in her final days as a failed monarch. The most frustrating aspect of these betrayals is that Jane seems to have understood exactly what was happening to her, but felt powerless to prevent it. Her letters from the Tower show someone who recognized that she had been used by people she had trusted, abandoned by people who had promised to support her, and sacrificed by people who claimed to love her. Yet she faced her fate with dignity, partly because she understood that rage and recrimination wouldn't change anything. The villains had gotten away with it. The innocent had paid the price. It was Tudor politics at its most ruthlessly typical. Here's something that might surprise you. Mary Tudor genuinely didn't want to execute Jane Grey. The popular narrative of Bloody Mary as a sadistic persecutor who enjoyed burning Protestants and chopping off heads misses the complexity of Mary's position and the impossible political calculations she faced as England's first undisputed queen regnant. Mary's decision to execute Jane wasn't driven by religious fanaticism or personal cruelty. It was the product of political mathematics, so brutal that even modern politicians would struggle with the moral implications. Mary had spent 37 years watching her father, Henry VIII, use executions as a political tool. She had seen how strategic killings could eliminate threats, intimidate opposition, and send messages to potential rebels. She had also seen how mercy could be interpreted as weakness, how spared enemies could become future problems, and how successful monarchs sometimes had to make choices that kept them awake at night. Mary understood better than most people that being a successful ruler often meant doing terrible things for necessary reasons. When Mary first captured Jane, her initial instinct was toward mercy, and for very good reasons. Executing Jane immediately would have made Mary look vindictive and cruel, particularly since Jane was young, female, and had clearly been manipulated by older men with their own agendas. Mary needed to establish her legitimacy through strength, yes, but also through magnanimity. Showing mercy to Jane while executing the real conspirators like John Dudley sent exactly the right message. Mary could be both just and merciful. Mary's attempts to convert Jane to Catholicism weren't just religious zealotry, they were sophisticated political strategy. If Jane could be convinced to renounce her Protestant beliefs and embrace Catholicism, it would accomplish several crucial objectives simultaneously. It would delegitimize Protestant claims that Mary was persecuting people for their faith, demonstrate that Catholic doctrine was superior to Protestant theology, and eliminate the threat Jane posed without the negative publicity of executing a teenager. The theological debates between Jane and Mary's representatives were genuine attempts at conversion, but they were also public relations exercises designed to show that Mary's government was reasonable, scholarly, and committed to saving souls rather than destroying them. When Jane proved impossible to convert, Mary found herself in an increasingly difficult position. How do you deal with someone whose very existence is a political threat, but whose execution would be morally problematic? Mary's marriage negotiations with Philip II of Spain complicated the Jane Grey situation enormously. English Protestant opposition to the Spanish marriage was fierce, and Jane's presence in the Tower gave that opposition a potential focal point. As long as Jane lived, she remained a possible alternative queen for anyone unhappy with Mary's Catholic, Restoration or foreign marriage. It didn't matter that Jane herself wanted nothing to do with future conspiracies. Her mere existence made her dangerous to Mary's political survival. Wyatt's rebellion was the breaking point that forced Mary's hand. Thomas Wyatt's Protestant uprising explicitly mentioned restoring Jane to the throne as one of its objectives, proving that Jane would inevitably become a symbol for future resistance movements, whether she wanted to be or not. The rebellion failed, but it demonstrated that Mary's fears about Jane's symbolic value were completely justified. Every future Protestant conspiracy would likely invoke Jane's name and claim to be acting in her interests. Mary's counselors were unanimous in their advice. Jane Grey had to die for the security of the realm. This wasn't revenge or religious persecution. It was cold political calculation. As long as Jane lived, Mary's throne would never be completely secure. Future rebellions would always have a potential alternative monarch to rally around, and Mary's government would always be vulnerable to claims that Jane was the rightful Protestant queen being held captive by a Catholic usurper. The decision tortured Mary precisely because she recognized its moral complexity. Mary wasn't a monster who enjoyed executions. She was a deeply religious woman who took seriously the Christian commandment against murder, but she was also a queen who understood that her first responsibility was to maintain the stability of the realm, even if that meant making choices that violated her personal moral preferences. Mary's comment that Jane's execution was necessary for the security of the realm reveals the anguish behind the decision. She wasn't claiming that Jane deserved to die or that execution was morally right. She was acknowledging that sometimes political necessity trumps personal morality, in ways that make successful rulership a burden rather than a privilege. It's the kind of choice that successful monarchs learn to make, and then live with for the rest of their lives. The timing of Jane's execution was also strategically calculated. Mary waited until after Wyatt's rebellion had been crushed and the immediate threat to her throne had passed. This demonstrated that the execution wasn't a panic decision made under pressure, but a deliberate choice made from a position of strength. Mary wanted to send the message that rebellion against her rule would be punished, but also that she was confident enough in her position to act deliberately rather than reactively. Mary's behavior during and after Jane's execution reveals her genuine emotional conflict about the decision. She granted Jane's request for several days to prepare spiritually for death, allowed her private execution befitting her noble rank, and reportedly showed visible distress when informed that the sentence had been carried out. These weren't the actions of someone who enjoyed the exercise of lethal power. They were the actions of someone trying to minimize the personal cruelty of a politically necessary decision. The long-term consequences of Mary's choice were exactly what she had feared they would be. Jane Grey's execution provided Protestant propagandists with a perfect martyr, and Mary's government with a permanent public relations disaster. Every subsequent Protestant who died during Mary's reign was compared to Jane Grey, and Mary's reputation for cruelty was largely built on her decision to execute England's most sympathetic teenage political prisoner. But here's the thing that Mary's critics often overlook. Her political calculations were probably correct. Jane's execution did eliminate a major threat to Mary's throne, and Mary successfully ruled for 5 more years without facing another serious succession challenge. The brutal mathematics of Tudor monarchy suggest that Mary's choice, however morally problematic, was politically sound. Sometimes successful rulership requires making decisions that are strategically correct but personally devastating. Mary Tudor faced an impossible choice between mercy and security, between personal morality and political necessity. She chose security and necessity, which made her a successful monarch, but a tortured human being. It's the kind of choice that reveals everything ugly about political power and everything tragic about the people who wield it successfully. The choice was made. The consequences were accepted, and Mary Tudor would carry the weight of that decision for the rest of her reign. Jane Grey's death sent shockwaves through English society that went far beyond the immediate political consequences of her failed coup. Within months of her execution, something remarkable began happening. People started questioning the entire system that had allowed a brilliant teenager to be manipulated into treason, and then abandoned to face the consequences alone. Jane's story became a catalyst for changes in how the English thought about royal succession, religious persecution, women's education, and the moral responsibilities of political leadership. The most immediate impact was on English Protestant identity. Jane Grey's martyrdom provided the reform movement with exactly the kind of inspiring figure it needed to survive Mary Tudor's Catholic restoration. But more than that, Jane's story changed how English Protestants understood their own faith. She had demonstrated that Protestant conviction could produce the same kind of heroic martyrdom that Catholics claimed was unique to their tradition, and she had done it with an intellectual sophistication that impressed even her enemies. John Fox's inclusion of Jane's story in his Acts and Monuments ensured that her martyrdom would be remembered and celebrated for centuries. But Fox's account did more than just preserve Jane's memory. It established a new template for Protestant heroism that emphasized intellectual courage, spiritual preparation, and dignified resistance to persecution. Jane Grey became the model for how educated English Protestants should face religious oppression, and her influence on English Protestant culture was profound and lasting. The constitutional implications of Jane's failed reign were equally significant. Her 9-day rule had demonstrated that theoretical legal claims to the throne meant nothing without popular acceptance and practical political support. This lesson would prove crucial during future succession crises, particularly when James II tried to restore Catholicism in the 1680s and was overthrown by the Protestant William of Orange. Jane Grey's failure had established the precedent that English succession must reflect the will of the nation as well as the letter of the law. Jane's story also had a transformative effect on attitudes toward women's education in England. Her remarkable learning had been central to her identity and crucial to her ability to face death with dignity. The widespread publication of her letters and theological writings provided compelling evidence that women could achieve the same level of intellectual sophistication as men, if given proper educational opportunities. Noble families across England began investing more seriously in their daughters' education, using Jane Grey as an example of what learned women could accomplish. The impact on English political culture was subtler, but equally important. Jane's manipulation by ambitious adults, and her abandonment by supposed allies, became a cautionary tale about the moral responsibilities of political leadership. Her story raised uncomfortable questions about the ethics of using young people as political pawns, and the obligations of politicians to the people they claim to represent. These questions wouldn't be fully answered for centuries, but Jane's story kept them alive in English political consciousness. Mary Tudor's decision to execute Jane also had long-term consequences for royal authority and public perception. Mary had made a strategically sound but morally problematic choice, and the public relations disaster that followed demonstrated the growing importance of popular opinion in English politics. Future monarchs would have to consider not just the political necessity of their decisions, but also how those decisions would be perceived by an increasingly literate and politically aware public. The European impact of Jane's story was equally significant. Protestant reformers across the continent seized on Jane's martyrdom as evidence that English Protestantism could produce saints and heroes to rival any Catholic tradition. Her letters were translated into multiple languages, her story was told in Protestant churches from Germany to Geneva, and her reputation helped establish England's credibility as a serious player in the European reform movement. Jane's influence on English literature and culture extended far beyond religious and political spheres. Her letters became models for how educated people should write about serious subjects, combining personal sincerity with intellectual rigor in ways that influenced generations of English writers. Her story inspired plays, poems, and novels that kept her memory alive in popular culture long after the immediate political circumstances of her death had been forgotten. The educational reforms that followed Jane's death were particularly significant for English women. Her demonstrated intellectual abilities provided compelling evidence for the arguments of humanist educators who believed that women were capable of the same level of learning as men. Schools and private tutors across England began offering more sophisticated curricula for female students, using Jane Grey as an example of what proper education could achieve. Jane's story also changed how the English thought about religious persecution and state power. Her execution had demonstrated that even the most admirable personal qualities, intelligence, piety, courage, integrity, couldn't protect someone from the brutal mathematics of political survival. This lesson contributed to the gradual development of English traditions, of religious tolerance, and constitutional limitations on royal power that would eventually make England famous for its relatively moderate approach to religious and political differences. The long-term impact on the Tudor dynasty itself was complex but significant. Jane's execution had eliminated a potential threat to Mary's throne, but it had also provided Protestant opposition with a permanent symbol of Catholic cruelty. When Elizabeth I became queen 5 years later, she inherited a kingdom where Protestant identity had been strengthened rather than weakened by Mary's persecutions, largely because martyrs like Jane Grey had demonstrated the heroic potential of Protestant conviction. Perhaps most importantly, Jane Grey's story established new expectations for how political leaders should behave under pressure. Her refusal to compromise her principles for personal survival, her dignified acceptance of the consequences of her actions, and her ability to find meaning in suffering became standards against which future political figures would be measured. Jane Grey had shown that it was possible to lose everything while still maintaining personal integrity, which was both an inspiring and a challenging example for future generations. The institutional changes that followed Jane's death were subtle but significant. The English political establishment began developing informal conventions about the treatment of political prisoners, the responsibilities of advisors to young monarchs, and the obligations of family members to protect their children from political manipulation. These changes didn't prevent future political tragedies, but they reflected a growing awareness that Jane Grey's fate had been both individually tragic and systemically problematic. By the time Elizabeth I died in 1603, Jane Grey had been transformed from a failed political conspirator into a permanent part of English cultural identity. Her story was taught to children, celebrated in literature, and invoked by politicians across the religious and political spectrum. She had achieved something that no successful monarch could match: immortality through moral example rather than political achievement. The girl was gone, but the changes she inspired would reshape England for centuries to come. What can we learn from Jane Grey's catastrophic encounter with royal power? More than you might expect, actually. Her story isn't just a tragic tale from Tudor England. It's a masterclass in political psychology, family dynamics, religious conviction, and the brutal mathematics of power that remain remarkably relevant today. Jane Grey's 9 Days on the Throne offer insights into leadership, manipulation, integrity, and survival that transcend their historical context and speak directly to modern dilemmas about authority, conscience, and moral courage. The first lesson is perhaps the most uncomfortable. Good intentions and moral superiority don't guarantee political success. Jane Grey was demonstrably more intelligent, better educated, and more principled than most of the people involved in her story. But none of those admirable qualities could overcome the simple fact that she lacked popular support and practical political backing. Intelligence without political wisdom, principles without strategic thinking, and moral conviction without practical support are often recipes for noble failure rather than meaningful success. This doesn't mean that principles are worthless in politics. Jane's principled stance gave her story lasting power and influenced English culture for centuries. But it does mean that good people who want to accomplish good things need to understand how power actually works, not just how it should work in an ideal world. Jane Grey's tragedy was that she was thrust into a situation that required political skills she had never been taught and strategic thinking she had never needed to develop. The second lesson concerns the dangers of being used as a symbol by people with their own agendas. Jane Grey became a Protestant icon, a Tudor princess, and a political alternative to Catholic rule. But she never had much control over how those symbolic roles were defined or deployed. The adults around her saw her symbolic value more clearly than her individual humanity, and they were willing to risk her life for causes she may not have fully understood or completely endorsed. This pattern repeats constantly in modern politics, where young people, minority figures, or individuals with compelling personal stories find themselves elevated as symbols for movements they didn't necessarily choose to represent. Jane's experience suggests that being a symbol can be more dangerous than being ignored, particularly when the people promoting your symbolic value have different interests and risk tolerances than you do. The third lesson involves the complexity of family loyalty and parental responsibility in political contexts. Jane's parents pushed her into accepting a crown that any reasonable analysis would have shown was likely to get her killed, and abandoned her when their scheme started falling apart. Her behavior reveals how easily family relationships can be corrupted when political ambition and personal survival are at stake. Modern parallels aren't hard to find. Parents who push their children into careers, relationships, or situations that serve the parents' ambitions rather than the children's interests. Families that sacrifice individual members for collective advancement, and situations where family loyalty becomes a tool for exploitation rather than protection. Jane Grey's story suggests that family relationships can be just as manipulative and self-serving as any other kind of political alliance. The fourth lesson concerns the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical wisdom. Jane Grey was extraordinarily well educated by 16th century standards, but her education had focused on languages, theology, and classical literature, rather than practical political skills or psychological insight into human behavior. She could debate Protestant doctrine in Latin, but she couldn't recognize when she was being manipulated by people who claimed to have her best interests at heart. This gap between theoretical knowledge and practical wisdom remains relevant in an age when people can acquire vast amounts of information without necessarily developing the judgment to use that information effectively. Jane's tragedy suggests that education without practical experience, knowledge without street smarts, and intellectual sophistication without psychological insight can be dangerous combinations in high-stakes situations. The fifth lesson involves the moral complexity of political leadership and the impossible choices that people in power sometimes face. Mary Tudor's decision to execute Jane Grey was politically sound but morally problematic, revealing how successful leadership often requires making choices that violate personal moral preferences for the sake of larger political objectives. Mary understood that sparing Jane might encourage future rebellions, but executing her would provide Protestant propagandists with a perfect martyr. This dilemma between moral idealism and political pragmatism appears constantly in modern political contexts. Leaders who must choose between campaign promises and governing realities, between personal principles and party loyalty, between short-term moral clarity and long-term strategic effectiveness. Jane Grey's story suggests that these choices are often genuine dilemmas without clear right answers, rather than simple tests of moral character. The sixth lesson concerns the power of narrative and the importance of controlling your own story. Jane Grey had no control over how her story would be remembered and used after her death, but that story became more politically powerful than her actual reign ever was. Protestant propagandists transformed her political failure into religious triumph, her personal tragedy into collective inspiration, and her individual suffering into lasting cultural change. This transformation demonstrates both the potential power of narrative and the dangers of losing control over your own story. In an age of social media and constant communication, the ability to shape how your actions and choices are perceived and remembered has become even more crucial for anyone involved in public life. The seventh and perhaps most important lesson involves the relationship between individual integrity and systemic corruption. Jane Grey maintained her personal principles throughout an impossible situation, refusing to compromise her religious beliefs even when conversion might have saved her life, standing up to her husband's political ambitions even when cooperation might have strengthened her position, and accepting responsibility for her actions even when she had been manipulated into taking them. Jane's integrity didn't save her life or change the immediate political circumstances she faced, but it gave her story moral authority that outlasted all the people who had used and abandoned her. Her example suggests that maintaining personal integrity in corrupt systems may be more important for long-term impact than achieving short-term political success. These lessons don't provide easy answers to modern political and personal dilemmas, but they do offer perspective on the timeless challenges of navigating power, family, principle, and survival in complex and morally ambiguous situations. Jane Grey's 9-day reign may have been a political disaster, but her response to that disaster offers insights that remain relevant centuries later. The crown was temporary, the lessons were permanent, and sometimes that's the most valuable kind of political education. What would Jane Grey make of our modern world? It's a fascinating question to consider, partly because Jane was in many ways a thoroughly modern person trapped in 16th century circumstances. Her emphasis on education, her belief in individual conscience, her commitment to reasoned argument over inherited authority, and her conviction that personal integrity matters more than political success, are all values that feel remarkably contemporary. Jane Grey might be more at home in the 21st century than she ever was in Tudor England. Jane's approach to religious belief, for instance, was based on personal study, individual conscience, and reasoned interpretation of texts rather than simple acceptance of traditional authority. She read the Bible in its original languages, engaged with contemporary theological scholarship, and formed her own conclusions about complex doctrinal questions. This kind of intellectual independence and critical thinking is exactly what modern education systems claim to promote, though it's worth noting that Jane's commitment to her conclusions was rather more absolute than most modern people would find comfortable. Her attitude toward gender roles was also surprisingly modern. Jane never seemed to doubt that her intelligence and education qualified her for serious intellectual discourse, regardless of contemporary assumptions about women's intellectual limitations. She debated theology with male scholars as an equal, expressed political opinions without apology, and refused to defer to her husband's ambitions simply because he was male. Jane Grey would probably be quite at home in modern discussions about gender equality and women's intellectual capabilities. Jane's relationship with political power offers particularly relevant insights for modern democratic societies. She understood that authority should be exercised with moral constraints, that leadership requires accepting responsibility for difficult decisions, and that personal popularity matters less than doing what you believe is right. These are concepts that modern politicians claim to embrace, but often struggle to implement when faced with the practical pressures of electoral politics and public opinion. What might surprise modern audiences is how Jane's religious convictions informed her political thinking in ways that were both progressive and conservative. Her Protestant emphasis on individual conscience and personal relationship with divine authority supported ideas about individual rights and limited government that modern liberals would recognize. But her absolute commitment to what she saw as religious truth would probably make modern secular audiences uncomfortable with its lack of relativism and compromise. Jane's educational background also offers interesting perspectives on modern debates about learning and intellectual development. She was fluent in multiple languages, familiar with classical literature and contemporary scholarship, and capable of sophisticated analysis in several different fields. But her education was also intensely focused on developing character, moral reasoning, and spiritual insight, in ways that modern educational systems often neglect in favor of technical skills and career preparation. The way Jane handled crisis and adversity offers particularly relevant lessons for modern stress management and resilience. Faced with imprisonment and the prospect of execution, she turned to reading, writing, and intellectual engagement as ways of maintaining psychological stability and moral clarity. She didn't rage against injustice or sink into depression. She used her intellectual resources to find meaning and purpose in an impossible situation. Jane's approach to family relationships would probably resonate with modern audiences dealing with toxic family dynamics and parental manipulation. She was clearly aware that her parents were using her for their own political advancement, but she also understood her obligations as a daughter and a member of a noble family. Her ability to maintain love for family members while recognizing their selfish behavior offers insights into how modern people might navigate similar situations. Her attitude toward marriage and personal relationships was also remarkably modern in some ways. Jane refused to allow her husband to claim royal authority simply by virtue of being married to her, insisting that political power had to be earned and legally granted rather than assumed through personal relationships. Modern audiences would probably appreciate her insistence on maintaining her own identity and authority within marriage, even under extreme political pressure. Jane's media strategy, if we can call it that, was also surprisingly sophisticated. Her letters from prison were clearly written with an awareness that they would be read by people beyond their immediate recipients, and she used them to shape public perception of her character and convictions. She understood that how she was remembered might be more important than whether she survived, which is a very modern approach to personal branding and legacy management. The parallels between Jane's situation and modern cancel culture are also worth considering. Jane was essentially cancelled by Tudor society for accepting a political position that was initially supported by powerful people, but became toxic when circumstances changed. Her former supporters abandoned her quickly when association with her became politically dangerous, leaving her to face the consequences of their shared decisions alone. Modern public figures who have experienced similar reversals of fortune might find Jane's dignified response to betrayal both inspiring and instructive. Jane's commitment to intellectual honesty and reasoned argument would probably make her an effective modern debater, though her absolute certainty about religious questions might make her less successful in contemporary political contexts that require compromise and coalition building. She was better at maintaining principles than at building consensus, which is both an admirable quality and a practical limitation in democratic politics. Her story also offers insights into modern discussions about youth in politics and the responsibilities of older generations toward young people who become involved in political movements. Jane was clearly used by adults who understood the risks better than she did, abandoned when their schemes failed, and left to pay the consequences for decisions she had been pressured into making. Modern political movements that elevate young spokespersons and activists might learn something from examining how poorly Jane's adult allies protected her when their causes became dangerous. Perhaps most importantly, Jane Grey's story offers a timeless example of how individual integrity can outlast political failure and personal tragedy. Her 9-day reign was a disaster, her execution was a tragedy, and her family abandoned her when she needed them most. But her commitment to living according to her principles and accepting responsibility for her choices gave her story moral authority that has lasted for centuries. In an age of political cynicism and moral relativism, Jane Grey's example suggests that character still matters, that principles are worth defending, and that how you handle failure may be more important than how you achieve success. Some values transcend their historical context. Jane Grey's commitment to integrity, learning, and moral courage speaks across the centuries to anyone wrestling with questions of conscience, principle, and personal responsibility. 500 years later, Jane Grey remains frozen in time as England's most compelling teenage tragedy. She never got the chance to grow old, make mistakes, compromise her principles, or disappoint the people who admired her. Death at 17 preserved her as the perpetual symbol of intellectual brilliance, moral courage, and principled resistance to corruption. It's a kind of immortality that comes at the ultimate price, but it's also granted Jane an influence on English culture and Protestant identity that no successful monarch could have achieved. This preservation in amber effect is both Jane's greatest triumph and her most heartbreaking limitation. We remember her as she was in her final months, brilliant, courageous, uncompromising, and utterly convinced of her own rightness. We don't know what kind of person she might have become, If she had lived to see 30, 50, or 70, would she have moderated her religious convictions? Would she have learned to compromise for practical advantage? Would she have become cynical about politics and human nature? We'll never know, because Jane Grey exists in our collective memory as the embodiment of teenage idealism at its most noble and most tragic. The literary and cultural impact of Jane's story has been remarkable in its persistence and adaptability. Every generation of English writers has found something relevant in her brief life and dramatic death. Romantic poets saw her as a symbol of individual conscience triumphing over political oppression. Victorian moralists used her as an example of how proper education and religious conviction could produce heroic character. Modern feminists have celebrated her as an early example of female intellectual achievement and political agency. Jane Grey has appeared in dozens of novels, plays, films, and television productions, each reflecting the concerns and values of its particular historical moment. Sometimes she's portrayed as an innocent victim of adult manipulation, sometimes as a committed Protestant willing to die for her faith, sometimes as an early feminist refusing to be controlled by the men around her. The fact that her story can support all these different interpretations suggests both its fundamental richness and its enduring relevance to changing cultural concerns. The educational impact of Jane's story has been particularly significant and long-lasting. For centuries, English schools used her as an example of what proper learning could accomplish and what moral courage looked like in practice. Children learnt about her linguistic abilities, her theological sophistication, and her dignified response to persecution. Jane Grey became part of the cultural DNA of English education, representing the ideal of learning combined with character that educational reformers claim to promote. Her influence on English Protestant identity can hardly be overstated. Jane provided the Reform movement with exactly the kind of inspiring martyr figure that could compete with Catholic saints and heroes. She wasn't just someone who had died for Protestant principles, she was someone who had died for them with such intellectual sophistication and personal dignity that even Catholic observers were impressed. John Fox's inclusion of her story in his Book of Martyrs ensured that Jane Grey would be remembered and celebrated in Protestant households for generations. The constitutional implications of Jane's brief reign have also had lasting significance for English political development. Her failure established important precedents about the relationship between legal claims to authority and practical political support. The lesson that theoretical legitimacy means nothing without popular acceptance became a cornerstone of English constitutional thinking and helped shape the country's distinctive approach to limited monarchy and parliamentary government. Jane's story has also contributed to English cultural attitudes toward youth, education, and moral responsibility in ways that extend far beyond immediate political or religious concerns. She became the archetype of the brilliant teenager who understands complex ideas but lacks the practical experience to navigate adult manipulation and political pressure. Her tragedy helped establish cultural expectations that adults have moral obligations to protect young people from exploitation, even when those young people are intellectually sophisticated and politically aware. The feminist implications of Jane's story have become increasingly important as women's roles in public life have expanded. Jane demonstrated that female intellectual achievement could be just as impressive as male scholarship, that women could maintain their principles under pressure just as effectively as men, and that feminine authority didn't require masculine approval or support. Her refusal to allow her husband to claim royal authority, simply by virtue of marriage, was a remarkable assertion of female political independence that resonates with modern discussions about gender and power. Jane's approach to religious conviction and intellectual integrity offers particularly relevant insights for modern discussions about fundamentalism, relativism, and moral certainty. She was absolutely convinced that her Protestant beliefs were correct and worth dying for, but she also engaged respectfully with Catholic scholars and maintained intellectual honesty in her theological debates. Jane managed to combine absolute conviction with intellectual sophistication in ways that might offer models for modern religious discourse. The psychological impact of Jane's story, particularly her response to betrayal, abandonment, and impending death, continues to fascinate modern audiences dealing with their own crises of faith, family dysfunction, and moral pressure. Jane's ability to maintain her sanity, dignity, and principles while facing impossible circumstances offers inspiration for anyone struggling with situations where doing the right thing seems likely to result in personal disaster. Perhaps most importantly, Jane Grey's story provides a permanent reminder that individual choices matter, even when they can't change immediate circumstances. Jane couldn't save her own life or prevent Mary Tudor's Catholic restoration, but her decisions about how to face death with dignity influenced English culture for centuries. Her example suggests that maintaining personal integrity may be more important than achieving political success, and that how we handle failure and adversity may define our legacy more than how we handle success and prosperity. The modern world has produced plenty of teenage activists, young political figures, and adolescent idealists who have faced adult manipulation and political pressure. Jane Grey's story offers both inspiration and warning for young people who find themselves elevated as symbols for causes they may not fully understand and abandoned by adults when those causes become inconvenient or dangerous. Jane Grey will remain 17 forever, brilliant and doomed, and absolutely certain of her own rightness. That eternal youth is both her tragedy and her triumph. She never had the chance to grow old and wise and compromised, but she also never lost the moral clarity and intellectual courage that made her story worth remembering. In a world that often seems short on heroes, Jane Grey's example of principled integrity in impossible circumstances continues to offer hope that character still matters and courage still counts. The teenager became immortal. The reign lasted 9 days. The influence continues 5 centuries later. Some stories are too powerful to die with their protagonists. And there you have it. The spectacular rise and catastrophic fall of Lady Jane Grey, England's most reluctant queen and history's most overqualified teenager. She wanted to read books. History gave her a crown. She chose integrity. Politics chose the act. But sometimes losing everything is the only way to win forever. Subscribe if you enjoyed this journey through history's most beautifully tragic political disaster, because apparently the best stories are the ones where nobody gets what they actually wanted.